The road leading to the mansion was long and winding, flanked by towering trees whose branches intertwined to form a canopy that cast shifting shadows on the ground. The Collins family, comprising David, his wife Julia, their teenage daughter Emma, and 9-year-old son Max, sat in silence as their SUV navigated the uneven path. Each carried a mixture of excitement and trepidation. The move was supposed to be a fresh start, a chance to leave behind the chaos of city life and embrace a quieter, simpler existence. But as the mansion came into view, a foreboding silence seemed to descend upon them. The mansion was enormous, a sprawling Gothic structure with weathered stone walls, pointed arches, and intricate ironwork that glinted faintly in the fading sunlight. Its grandeur was undeniable, but it carried an air of melancholy, as though it had been waiting too long for life to return. "It's breathtaking," Julia whispered, though her voice lacked conviction. David, ever the optimist, smiled. "Just wait until we see the inside. It's going to be perfect." Inside, the house was just as imposing as its exterior. The grand foyer stretched upwards for 3 stories, dominated by an opulent chandelier that dangled precariously from a vaulted ceiling. Dust coated the floor in uneven patches, and the air smelled faintly of mildew. Emma wrinkled her nose. "Smells like something died in here." Max, clutching a stuffed dinosaur, stared at the staircase that spiraled upward. "It's like a castle," he said with a mix of awe and unease. The family began exploring their new home, splitting up to cover its many rooms. Julia gravitated toward the kitchen, its antique cabinets and rusted appliances offering a glimpse into the mansion's history. David was drawn to the library, a cavernous room filled with towering shelves that bowed slightly under the weight of ancient books. Meanwhile, Emma wandered upstairs, where a long corridor stretched endlessly, lined with closed doors that seemed to watch her every move. Max, however, was fixated on something else entirely. Near the back of the mansion, he found a door partially hidden behind a tapestry. The tapestry depicted a haunting scene, a family standing together under a gnarled tree, their faces obscured by shadow. Behind the door was a narrow staircase leading down into darkness. "Dad!" Max called, his voice echoing faintly. David arrived moments later, brushing dust from his hands. "What did you find, buddy?" Max pointed at the door, but David only chuckled. "Probably just storage," he said. "We'll check it out later." As night fell, the family gathered in the living room. Julia had managed to get the fireplace roaring, and the warm glow softened the mansion's cold, uninviting atmosphere. They ate takeout pizza by firelight, laughing at the absurdity of their situation. "We're like pioneers," David joked. Emma rolled her eyes, but smiled despite herself. For a brief moment, the house felt less like an ancient, forgotten relic and more like a home. That feeling didn't last. As the family prepared for bed, strange noises began to echo through the mansion. At first, it was faint, a creak here, a soft thud there. Julia dismissed it as the house settling, but the sounds grew louder. Emma swore she heard footsteps in the hallway outside her room, but when she opened the door, the corridor was empty. Max claimed he saw a shadow move in the corner of his room, but David brushed it off as a trick of the light. By midnight, the house had grown eerily quiet. Julia lay awake, staring at the ornate patterns on the bedroom ceiling, her unease growing with every passing minute. David, snoring softly beside her, seemed blissfully unaware. A sudden noise, like a distant wail, shattered the silence. Julia sat up, her heart pounding. She listened intently, but the sound didn't come again. Down the hall, Emma was wide awake, clutching her phone as she scrolled through social media. A notification popped up, but it wasn't from any of her usual apps. It was a message, "Welcome home." Her heart skipped a beat. She stared at the screen, but the message vanished as quickly as it had appeared. She told herself it must have been a glitch, but the unease in her chest refused to subside. Max, meanwhile, had drifted off to sleep, his stuffed dinosaur tucked under one arm. But his dreams were anything but peaceful. He dreamed of the tapestry he'd seen earlier. Only now the shadowed family in the image seemed to move, their heads slowly turning to face him. One of them, a small figure with indistinct features, raised a hand as though beckoning him closer. Max woke with a start, his heart racing. From the hallway outside his room came the faint sound of footsteps. Morning couldn't come soon enough, but as the first rays of sunlight filtered through the mansion's stained glass windows, the Collins family was left with a lingering sense that their new beginning was not as promising as they had hoped. The mansion had welcomed them, but it had done so on its own terms. The morning sunlight streamed through the ornate stained glass windows, casting fractured patterns of red, green, and gold across the mansion's grand foyer. Julia was the first to wake, her rest plagued by fragmented dreams she couldn't quite piece together. She stepped into the kitchen, hoping for the comfort of coffee, only to find the countertops dustier than she remembered and a faint smell of decay wafting from the sink. Wrinkling her nose, she made a mental note to hire a cleaning service. David entered moments later, chipper as always. "Morning," he said, planting a kiss on Julia's cheek. "Sleep well." Julia hesitated, her eyes drifting toward the ceiling as if the answer lay somewhere in the wood beams. "Not really," she admitted. "This house, it's just so quiet at night." "Too quiet." David chuckled. "We'll get used to it. Big old houses like this always take some adjustment." Julia nodded, but the unease from the night before still lingered. Emma and Max were less enthusiastic about the new day. Emma sat at the dining table, her phone glued to her hand, while Max picked at a bowl of cereal. "I heard footsteps last night," Max said suddenly, his voice cutting through the quiet. Julia froze mid-sip of her coffee. "Sweetheart, it's probably just the house settling," she said, echoing David's words from the night before. Max shook his head. It sounded like someone walking, slow and heavy. Emma rolled her eyes. "You're just trying to freak everyone out," she said, but her tone lacked its usual bite. She hadn't mentioned the strange message she'd received, dismissing it as a prank or a glitch, but the memory of it still made her stomach churn. Later that day, the family decided to explore more of the mansion. The West Wing, where many of the rooms had been locked, seemed like a good place to start. David tried several doors, only to find them jammed or bolted shut. "We'll need a locksmith," he said with a shrug. As they moved down the hall, Julia noticed something odd. A faint sound, like muffled whispers, seemed to emanate from the walls. She pressed her ear against the wallpaper, her brow furrowing. "Do you hear that?" she asked, turning to David. He paused, listening intently, but shook his head. "Probably the wind," he said, dismissing it. Julia wasn't convinced. The sound was too rhythmic, too deliberate. Max, who had been trailing behind the group, wandered into an open room. It was a small study, the walls lined with dusty bookshelves. On the desk sat an antique clock, its hands frozen at 3:33. He reached out to touch it when the sound of a creaking floorboard made him spin around. No one was there, but the door, which had been wide open moments before, was now ajar. Meanwhile, Emma had ventured into the attic. The steep, creaky staircase led to a cavernous space filled with forgotten furniture, trunks, and cobwebs. She found an old full-length mirror tucked into a corner, its surface cracked in several places. As she gazed into it, she thought she saw movement, a flicker of something in the reflection. She turned around, but the attic was empty. Swallowing her fear, she snapped a quick photo of the mirror with her phone and hurried back downstairs. By evening, the whispers had become more pronounced. Julia heard them while cooking dinner, faint voices that seemed to rise and fall, as though holding a conversation just out of earshot. David heard them while tinkering with the thermostat, though he chalked it up to old pipes. Emma and Max heard them too, though neither wanted to admit it. As the family sat down for dinner, the tension in the room was palpable. The grand dining hall, with its high ceilings and elaborate chandeliers, should have felt impressive, but instead it loomed over them, making the space feel cold and hollow. Halfway through the meal, a loud bang echoed from the West Wing, causing everyone to jump. "What was that?" Julia asked, her voice barely a whisper. David stood, trying to mask his own unease. "I'll check it out," he said, grabbing a flashlight. Emma followed him, despite his protests. They moved cautiously through the dark hallways, the beam of the flashlight bouncing off the dusty walls. When they reached the source of the noise, they found nothing but an overturned chair in one of the rooms. "That's weird," David muttered, righting the chair. Emma, however, noticed something else. The wallpaper in the room seemed different, ripped and curling in places, as though something had been scratching at it from the inside. She said nothing, but her unease grew with every passing second. By the time they returned to the dining room, the whispers had stopped, but the oppressive silence that followed was even worse. No one spoke as they finished their meal, each of them haunted by the growing realization that the house was far from the lifeless structure they had believed it to be. Something was alive within its walls, and it was watching them. The third morning in the mansion dawned gray and overcast, with clouds blanketing the sky and muting the landscape. Julia woke earlier than usual, unsettled by a dream in which she wandered endless hallways, doors slamming shut behind her wherever she turned. She brewed a pot of coffee and stared out the kitchen window, watching the dense fog roll across the overgrown garden. Something about the fog made the world beyond seem unreachable, as though the mansion was its own isolated universe. David was the next to wake, cheerful as ever despite the heavy atmosphere. "The locksmith's coming today," he announced over breakfast. "We'll finally get those doors open and see what's behind them." Julia glanced at him, her expression wary. "Do you think we should?" she asked. David laughed. "What do you mean? It's our house. Of course, we should know what's in every room." Emma barely looked up from her phone, though her fingers tapped idly against the screen rather than scrolling. She tried to research the mansion online the previous night, curious about its history, but had found almost nothing. The property wasn't listed in any real estate records, and searches for its address yielded only dead ends. The more she thought about it, the stranger it seemed. How had her father even found this place? Max, on the other hand, was unusually quiet, pushing his food around his plate. He hadn't mentioned the dream he'd had of the small shadowy figure from the tapestry, but it had left him shaken. When Julia asked if he was feeling all right, he nodded and forced a weak smile. By mid-morning, the locksmith arrived, a gruff older man who seemed uneasy from the moment he stepped inside. He examined the mansion's ornate doors with a furrowed brow, muttering to himself as he worked. When David asked if there was a problem, the man hesitated. "These locks are old," he said finally. "Real old. Haven't seen anything like 'em in years." The first door opened with a loud click, revealing a room filled with antique furniture covered in white sheets. Dust hung thick in the air, and the faint scent of decay lingered. As the family entered, Julia noticed an old phonograph on a small table. She lifted the needle curiously, and to her surprise, it began to play. A haunting melody filled the room, the sound scratchy and distant, as though coming from another time. "That's creepy," Emma said, stepping back. Max clung to Julia's side, his eyes wide. David laughed nervously. "It's just an old record. Nothing to be scared of." But as the phonograph continued to play, the room seemed to grow colder. Julia quickly lowered the needle, cutting the music short. The locksmith moved on to the next door, which opened into a long hallway lined with faded portraits. The faces in the paintings were blurred and indistinct, as though the artist had been unable or unwilling to fully capture their features. At the end of the hall stood a single door, its surface engraved with strange, swirling patterns. "This one's different," the locksmith muttered, running his hand over the engraving. It took him longer to open, and when the lock finally gave way, the door creaked open to reveal a narrow spiral staircase descending into darkness. "Basement, maybe?" David said, peering into the void. The locksmith shook his head. "I'm not going down there," he said firmly, packing up his tools. David fetched a flashlight, his curiosity outweighing his caution. "I'll check it out," he said, starting down the staircase. Julia grabbed his arm. "David, wait. We don't even know where it leads." He offered her a reassuring smile. "It's just a basement, Jules. Don't worry." Emma and Max stood at the top of the stairs as David disappeared into the darkness. The air grew colder with each step he took, and the faint scent of earth and mildew filled his nostrils. At the bottom, he found a large, cavernous room filled with strange artifacts, rusted tools, broken furniture, and what appeared to be ritualistic carvings etched into the stone walls. "David," Julia's voice echoed from above. "What's down there?" He hesitated, unsure how to respond. The carvings were intricate, depicting strange symbols and figures that seemed to move under the flickering light of his flashlight. In the center of the room stood a pedestal, and on it lay a small, black box. It looked newer than everything else, as though it had been placed there recently. "Just some old junk," David called back, his voice uneven. He approached the pedestal, his hand hovering over the box. Something about it drew him in, though he couldn't explain why. Against his better judgment, he picked it up. The moment his fingers touched the surface, a deep rumble echoed through the room, shaking the walls. "David!" Julia shouted. "Come back up!" He stumbled back toward the staircase, clutching the box tightly. As he ascended, the rumbling stopped, but a faint whispering sound seemed to follow him. When he emerged, Julia looked at him with a mixture of relief and alarm. "What's that?" she asked, pointing to the box. "I don't know," David admitted, his voice shaking. "But I think it doesn't want to stay down there." And neither did they. The box sat on the dining room table, its presence heavy and oppressive. David had placed it there after returning from the basement, though he couldn't explain why he hadn't simply left it behind. The box itself was small and unassuming, made of a dark, smooth wood with no visible seams or hinges. Despite its simplicity, it seemed to draw the family's attention like a magnet. "I don't like it," Julia said, her voice tense. She stood at the far end of the room, arms crossed tightly over her chest. "You should have left it where you found it." David frowned but said nothing. He didn't want to admit how compelled he had felt to bring the box upstairs, as though it had chosen him rather than the other way around. Emma sat across from her parents, staring at the box intently. "Have you tried opening it?" she asked, leaning forward. "Maybe there's something inside, like an old letter or a key." Max, seated beside her, shook his head vehemently. "Don't open it," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "It's bad." "Bad? Don't be ridiculous," David said, though his tone lacked conviction. He reached out to touch the box, but the moment his fingers brushed the wood, a faint whisper filled the room. It was like the sound of wind passing through a narrow gap, soft yet insistent. Everyone froze. "Did you hear that?" Julia asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The children nodded, their faces pale. David pulled his hand back, the whispering stopping instantly. A heavy silence followed, broken only by the faint creak of the house settling around them. Julia took a step closer to her husband, her expression tight with fear. "This isn't normal, David. Whatever that thing is, it doesn't belong here." He opened his mouth to respond, but the words caught in his throat. Deep down, he knew she was right. That night, the family tried to go about their routines, but the atmosphere in the house had shifted. Max refused to sleep in his own room and instead camped out on the floor of Emma's. Julia stayed up late, pacing the living room and glancing repeatedly at the box, as though expecting it to move on its own. Around midnight, Emma woke to the sound of soft tapping. She sat up in bed, her heart racing as she listened. The sound was rhythmic, like fingers drumming on wood. She glanced at Max, who was still fast asleep, then tiptoed to her door. The tapping grew louder as she stepped into the hallway, coming from the direction of the dining room. "Hello," she called softly, her voice trembling. No response. She crept down the stairs, her phone flashlight casting long, eerie shadows across the walls. When she reached the dining room, the tapping stopped. The box sat where they had left it, unchanged. But as she approached, a cold draft brushed against her skin, making her shiver. Emma's curiosity outweighed her fear. She reached out cautiously, her fingers grazing the smooth surface of the box. The whispering started again, faint but urgent, as though pleading with her. She snatched her hand back and turned to run, but before she could move, the lid of the box slowly slid open on its own. A low, guttural hum filled the room, vibrating through the floor and walls. Emma stumbled backward, her phone clattering to the ground as the light flickered erratically. From within the box, a faint, pale mist began to rise, curling and twisting like smoke. Emma screamed, the sound echoing through the house and waking the others. Julia and David rushed downstairs, finding Emma frozen in the doorway of the dining room, her face white with terror. The mist had dissipated, and the box was once again closed, as though nothing had happened. "What's going on?" Julia demanded, gripping Emma's shoulders. Emma stammered, struggling to find the words. It had opened, on its own, and there was something inside, something alive. David stared at the box, his stomach sinking. He didn't know what they had unleashed, but it was clear now that the box wasn't just an artifact. It was something far more sinister. "I'm getting rid of it," he said firmly, grabbing the box. Julia reached out to stop him. Fear etched across her face. "Wait! What if it's dangerous to move it again? What if it makes things worse?" "Things are already worse," David snapped, though he regretted the harshness in his tone immediately. He turned to Emma, his voice softer. "I'll take care of it. Don't worry." But as he carried the box toward the front door, the whispering started again, louder this time, rising into a crescendo that seemed to scream, "Don't." David hesitated, his grip tightening on the box as his pulse pounded in his ears. Julia and the children watched, their fear palpable. And then, with a final, determined breath, David opened the door and stepped into the cold night air, the box clutched tightly in his hands. As the door closed behind him, the house seemed to exhale, the oppressive weight lifting ever so slightly. But Julia couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over, not by a long shot. David carried the box across the lawn, his steps crunching against the gravel of the driveway. The air outside was unnervingly still, as though the wind itself were holding its breath. He stopped at the edge of the property, where the dense forest loomed like a wall of shadows. The whispering from the box grew louder, more urgent, as though it were begging him to stop. "You're just a box," he muttered under his breath, though his hands trembled. He crouched near the base of a tree and began digging with a rusty spade he had grabbed from the garage. With every scoop of dirt, the whispering shifted into a low, guttural groan, sending shivers down his spine. He worked faster, desperate to bury the object and rid himself of its oppressive aura. Inside the house, Julia sat on the living room couch with Emma and Max huddled close. The children were silent, their faces pale as they stared at the front door. Julia tried to reassure them, but her own nerves betrayed her. "Daddy's going to take care of it," she said softly, though the words felt hollow. As the minutes stretched into what felt like hours, a faint sound drifted into the house. At first, it was barely perceptible, like the rustle of leaves. Then it grew louder, a distant, hollow echo of David's voice calling for help. Julia froze, her eyes widening. "Dad?" Emma whispered, clutching her mother's arm. Julia stood abruptly, her pulse racing. She hesitated only for a moment before heading for the door. "Stay here," she instructed the children, though she doubted they would obey. Outside, the night was darker than Julia remembered, the moon obscured by thick, fast-moving clouds. "David," she called, stepping onto the lawn. The forest loomed in front of her, an impenetrable void of black. She strained her ears, but the sound of his voice was gone. David, meanwhile, had just finished burying the box. He patted the soil down with the spade and stood up, his chest heaving. The whispering had stopped, leaving an eerie silence that made him feel exposed. But as he turned to head back to the house, a sharp, crackling sound echoed from the trees behind him. "Who's there?" he demanded, spinning around. His flashlight illuminated nothing but gnarled tree trunks and tangled underbrush. The sound came again, closer this time, a deliberate crunch of leaves and twigs. "This isn't funny," he called, his voice unsteady. A cold wind whipped through the clearing, carrying with it a low, guttural growl. David stumbled backward, his flashlight shaking as he swept the beam across the forest. Suddenly, the ground beneath him shifted. He glanced down in horror as the freshly buried soil began to sink, collapsing into itself as though something was clawing its way out. He barely had time to react before a hand, pale, skeletal, and impossibly long, shot out of the ground. It gripped his ankle with inhuman strength, pulling him down. He screamed, thrashing wildly, but the hand was relentless. More arms emerged, clawing their way toward him as a dark, shadowy figure rose from the earth. Julia heard his scream and ran toward the forest, her heart pounding. "David!" she shouted, plunging into the trees despite the overwhelming sense of dread. Emma and Max, unable to stay behind, followed her at a distance, their small flashlights bobbing like fireflies. When Julia reached the clearing, she froze. The ground was torn apart. The soil churned as though something had erupted from below. David was nowhere to be seen. "David!" she cried again, her voice breaking. A faint whispering surrounded her, growing louder with every second. Emma and Max arrived, their faces white with terror. "Mom, what's happening?" Emma asked, her voice trembling. Before Julia could answer, a cold, oppressive wind swept through the clearing, extinguishing their flashlights. The whispering grew deafening, rising into a cacophony of voices, each overlapping the other in a sinister chorus. And then, just as suddenly as it began, the noise stopped. The family stood in the suffocating silence, their breaths visible in the frigid air. Julia gripped her children tightly, her eyes scanning the darkness. "We need to leave," she said firmly, her voice shaking. As they turned to run back to the house, a figure stepped out from the shadows. It was David, but something was wrong. His eyes glowed faintly, and his movements were jerky, as though he were a marionette controlled by invisible strings. He smiled, but the expression was hollow, his face stretched in a way that didn't seem human. "David?" Julia whispered, taking a cautious step forward. He tilted his head, the smile widening. "I buried the box," he said, his voice low and distorted. "But it's not gone. It will never be gone." The wind howled around them, and in that moment, Julia realized the truth. Whatever they had disturbed, it wasn't confined to the box. It was loose now, free to roam, and it had already claimed its first victim. The family sprinted back to the mansion, their hearts pounding in unison. Julia's hand gripped Emma's tightly, while Max struggled to keep up, his flashlight beam bouncing wildly across the ground. Behind them, the figure that had once been David didn't pursue, but lingered at the edge of the woods, his glowing eyes tracking their movements. When they reached the porch, Julia slammed the door shut and locked it, though the act felt futile against the unnatural presence outside. The mansion, once imposing, now felt suffocating, its vastness shrouded in silence. Julia knelt before Emma and Max, clutching them to her chest. "We'll be okay," she murmured, though she didn't believe her own words. Emma's tearful voice broke the silence. "That wasn't Dad, was it?" Julia hesitated, unsure how to answer. The thing in the woods had David's face, but everything about it, its movements, its aura, felt alien. "I don't know," she finally admitted. "But whatever it is, we can't let it in." The children nodded, their faces pale with fear. Julia guided them to the living room and lit the fireplace. The flickering flames cast long shadows that seemed to writhe and twist on the walls. Julia caught herself glancing over her shoulder every few seconds, expecting to see the glowing eyes in the windows. After a while, she began pacing the room, her mind racing. The box, the whispers, the skeletal hand, none of it made sense. David's words echoed in her mind. "It will never be gone." She glanced at the children, huddled together on the couch, and knew she couldn't wait for answers to come to her. Leaving the children momentarily, Julia ventured into the study, where stacks of books had been left by the previous owners. She scanned the titles, hoping for something, anything, that might explain the horrors unfolding around them. Her fingers paused on a leather-bound volume with no title. It was old, its pages yellowed and brittle. Opening the book, Julia discovered a handwritten account of a family who had lived in the mansion decades earlier. The entries were fragmented, filled with desperate pleas and warnings. One line stood out, scrawled in large, jagged letters. "Do not disturb the ground beneath the northern grove." Julia's stomach turned as she realized the grove described in the journal matched the area where David had buried the box. The journal spoke of rituals, offerings, and a malevolent entity bound to the property. It warned that the box was a seal, a fragile barrier between the living and the horrors beyond. If tampered with, the entity could manifest, taking on forms that would exploit the weaknesses and fears of its victims. A loud crash interrupted Julia's reading. She bolted back to the living room to find the children staring at the front door, which was now ajar, swinging in the wind. Julia's heart sank. "Did you unlock the door?" she asked, her voice trembling. Emma and Max shook their heads vigorously. "Stay here," Julia ordered, grabbing a fire poker from the hearth. She stepped cautiously toward the door, her grip on the makeshift weapon tightening. Outside, the yard was eerily quiet, the air heavy with an unnatural stillness. She scanned the area, her eyes darting to the forest's edge where David, or the thing wearing his face, had stood. The porch creaked beneath her feet as she stepped out, the cold night air biting her skin. She felt exposed, as if 100 unseen eyes were watching her every move. Suddenly, a rustling sound came from the bushes nearby. Julia raised the poker, her body tensed. But it wasn't David. It was a deer, or what remained of one. The animal's body was twisted and broken, its eyes glowing faintly with the same unnatural light she had seen in David's. It stumbled forward, its movements jerky and wrong, before collapsing in a heap at her feet. Julia staggered back, choking on a scream. As she turned to retreat into the house, she felt a sudden, overwhelming presence behind her. The air grew colder, and a deep, guttural voice whispered, "You've seen too much." She spun around, but there was nothing there, just the yawning darkness of the forest. Julia ran inside and slammed the door, bolting it shut. The children rushed to her side, their eyes wide with fear. "Mom, what's happening?" Max asked, his voice trembling. Julia knelt down and held them close. "We're going to figure this out," she said, though her voice betrayed her terror. The fire crackled softly in the background as Julia tried to piece together the fragments of the journal's warnings. She knew one thing for certain. The mansion wasn't just haunted. It was a prison for something far more dangerous. And now it was awake. The night stretched on, heavy and oppressive, as Julia sat in the living room with Emma and Max. The fire's warmth was the only thing keeping the chill at bay, though the shadows it cast seemed to deepen the unease in the room. Julia had barely spoken since returning from the porch, her mind replaying the warning from the journal. "Do not disturb the ground beneath the northern grove." Emma broke the silence first, her voice barely above a whisper. "Mom, what if Dad's still out there? What if he needs our help?" Julia's stomach twisted. She wanted to reassure her daughter, to promise her that everything would be okay, but the image of David, if it even was David, lurking at the edge of the forest haunted her. "We can't think about that right now," Julia said, her voice firmer than she felt. "We need to stay safe, and that means staying inside." Emma and Max exchanged a glance, their fear evident, but tempered by trust in their mother's words. Unable to shake the urgency she felt, Julia retrieved the leather-bound journal from the study and settled by the fire. She skimmed through its entries, hoping to find a solution. The handwriting grew increasingly erratic as the pages progressed, detailing rituals to placate the entity and desperate attempts to keep it contained. One passage stood out. "It will use what you love against you. It will wear the faces of those you trust." Julia's breath caught as she read the line again. A sinking realization washed over her. Whatever was out there, it wasn't David. It was something else, something far older and more malevolent. The journal also mentioned a ritual to reinforce the seal, an offering of blood to the earth beneath the grove. Julia's hands trembled as she closed the book. The idea of venturing back to the grove, where the entity's presence felt strongest, made her stomach churn. But if it meant protecting her children, she knew she would have to consider it. A sudden thud from upstairs shattered her thoughts. Julia jumped to her feet, gripping the fire poker tightly. "Stay here," she instructed Emma and Max, her voice shaking. She climbed the staircase slowly, every creak of the floorboards echoing like a scream in the silence. The hallway upstairs was dim, illuminated only by the faint moonlight filtering through a window at the far end. The door to the master bedroom was ajar, and Julia could feel a faint, icy draft emanating from within. Her hand tightened on the poker as she pushed the door open. The room was empty, but the window was wide open, the curtains fluttering in the cold night air. Julia's eyes scanned the room, landing on the bed where something small and dark lay atop the sheets. Stepping closer, she realized it was the box David had unearthed, the same box she had seen buried again in the grove. Her heart raced. How had it gotten here? The lid was slightly ajar, and the faint whispers that had plagued her dreams now filled the room, their cadence slow and deliberate, like an ancient chant. She fought the urge to touch it, to open it completely and see what lay inside. Suddenly, a voice spoke from behind her. "Julia." She spun around, nearly dropping the poker. David stood in the doorway, his face pale and gaunt, his eyes shadowed with an unnatural glow. "It's me," he said, his tone eerily calm. "I came back for you." Julia took a step back, her grip tightening on the poker. "You're not him," she said, her voice barely audible. David, or the thing wearing his face, tilted his head, a sad smile creeping across his lips. "You're afraid of me, but I'm here to help. We can end this together, Julia." She wanted to believe him, every fiber of her being screamed for her to run into his arms, to let him take away the burden of fear and uncertainty. But the journal's warning echoed in her mind. "It will wear the faces of those you trust." "I don't believe you," she said, her voice steadier now. The figure sighed, its sad smile twisting into something colder, more predatory. "Then you'll never know the truth," it whispered before vanishing, leaving the doorway empty. Julia stumbled back, her legs giving out as she collapsed onto the bed. The whispers from the box grew louder, their rhythm frantic and chaotic. She grabbed the box and slammed the lid shut, silencing the voices. As she returned to the living room, she found Emma and Max huddled together, their faces pale. "What happened?" Max asked. Julia couldn't bring herself to tell them. Instead, she pulled them close and whispered, "We'll get through this. I promise." But deep down, she wasn't sure how much longer she could keep that promise. The next morning dawned gray and lifeless. The sunlight diffused through a dense shroud of clouds that seemed to press down on the house. Julia awoke with a start, the memory of the night before seared into her mind. She had barely slept, her thoughts consumed by the whispers, the journal, and the thing that wore David's face. As she sat up in bed, her eyes drifted to the corner where the box now rested, locked and wrapped tightly in a blanket as if they could contain its malevolence. Downstairs, Emma and Max sat at the kitchen table, poking at their bowls of cereal. The air between them was heavy with unspoken fears. Julia forced a smile as she joined them, though her trembling hands betrayed her nerves. "We're going to be okay," she said, her voice too bright to be convincing. "I just need to figure a few things out." Max looked up from his bowl, his eyes wide with worry. "Mom, what if Dad comes back again?" Julia froze for a moment, her pulse quickening. She leaned down and placed a hand on his shoulder. "If that happens, we don't open the door. No matter what." After breakfast, Julia returned to the journal, combing through the entries for any mention of the box. It wasn't until she reached the final pages that she found what she was looking for. The box is a vessel, a trap for the thing that dwells here. But the seal is weakening. It feeds on fear, and every crack in the family bond gives it strength. Julia's stomach dropped as she reread the passage. It wasn't just the house or the grove. It was them. Their fear, their arguments, their fractured trust had given the entity the power to seep into their lives. She needed to find a way to break the cycle. The passage also mentioned a crucial detail. The vessel cannot be destroyed, but it can be hidden in a place where it cannot call out. Julia's thoughts turned to the grove, the warnings about disturbing the soil, and the box's mysterious return to the house. The answer lay beneath the northern grove, but the thought of facing the entity's stronghold filled her with dread. Emma interrupted her thoughts with a hesitant knock on the study door. "Mom, there's something outside." Julia's heart sank as she followed Emma to the window. In the distance, near the edge of the forest, the figure of David stood motionless, staring at the house. He made no move to approach, but his presence was like a shadow stretching across their minds. Julia knew she had to act. Grabbing a flashlight and the box, she told Emma and Max to stay inside and lock the doors. "Don't open them for anyone, not even me," she warned. The path to the grove was overgrown, the tangled branches and roots seeming to twist of their own accord. Julia's every step felt heavier than the last, the air thick with an unnatural stillness. When she finally reached the clearing, the grove's trees loomed like silent sentinels, their gnarled branches reaching toward the sky. Standing in the center of the grove, Julia felt the ground pulse faintly beneath her feet, as though the earth itself were alive. She knelt and began to dig, her hands shaking as she unearthed the disturbed soil. The whispers started again, faint at first, then rising to a cacophony of pleading, anger, and something darker, a promise of despair. When the hole was deep enough, Julia placed the box inside and began covering it with dirt. The whispers grew louder, but she forced herself to keep going. Finally, the last handful of soil fell into place, and the whispers stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was deafening. Julia stood, her breath coming in ragged gasps. For a moment, the grove was still, but then a low rumble shook the ground, and a shadow passed over the clearing. It wasn't coming from the trees or the sky. It was emanating from the ground beneath her. Panicking, Julia turned and ran back toward the house. The shadows seemed to follow her, darting between the trees like living things. When she reached the back door, she pounded on it frantically. "It's me! Let me in!" Emma's voice called from inside. "How do we know it's really you?" Julia hesitated, tears streaming down her face. "Because I love you. Because I promised I'd keep you safe." There was a pause. Then the door unlocked, and Emma pulled her mother inside. Julia collapsed to the floor, clutching her children as tears of relief mingled with her exhaustion. But even as she held them, a chill settled over her. The box was buried, but the grove's reaction had been violent and immediate. Julia glanced at the window, where the edge of the forest loomed in the distance. The battle wasn't over. If anything, it was just beginning. The atmosphere inside the house was suffocating that evening, as though the very walls had absorbed the tension and dread. Julia sat at the dining table with Emma and Max. The three of them huddled together in uneasy silence. A fire crackled in the hearth, but its warmth did little to dispel the chill that seemed to emanate from the corners of the room. Julia tried to focus on normalcy, setting out a simple dinner of soup and bread, but her hands trembled as she ladled the broth into bowls. Max stirred his food aimlessly, his face pale and drawn, while Emma glanced nervously at the window every few minutes. The silence was broken only by the occasional creak of the house settling, though each sound felt charged with sinister intent. "Mom," Emma finally whispered, her voice almost drowned out by the fire's crackle. "What did you do with the box?" Julia hesitated, her gaze fixed on the flickering flames. "I buried it," she said, her voice low. "In the grove. It's where it was meant to stay. But it's not over, is it?" Emma asked, her tone sharper this time. Julia's silence was answer enough. Later that night, as the children tried to sleep, Julia wandered through the house, her nerves too raw to allow her any rest. The shadows seemed to shift and stretch as she moved, and the sound of her own footsteps felt unnaturally loud in the oppressive stillness. She passed the hallway mirror and froze. Her reflection stared back at her, but something was wrong. The face in the mirror was her own, yet the expression was subtly off, a faint smirk that didn't match the worry etched on her real face. Her heart pounded as she stepped closer, inspecting the reflection with mounting dread. "Julia," the reflection whispered, though her lips remained still. She stumbled back, nearly knocking over a small table behind her. The voice came again, this time louder, more insistent. "You think you can bury it and be free? You brought this on yourself." Julia fled from the mirror, her breath coming in ragged gasps as she hurried to the safety of her bedroom. She slammed the door shut and leaned against it, her mind racing. The house wasn't just haunted, it was alive, and it was playing with her. The night dragged on, each hour marked by strange noises that echoed through the house. Faint footsteps, distant whispers, and the occasional sharp thud that made her jolt upright. She checked on the children twice, finding them restless but safe in their beds. Just as she began to doze off in the early hours of the morning, a loud crash shattered the fragile quiet. Julia bolted upright, her heart hammering. She grabbed the flashlight from her bedside table and crept out of her room, her hands shaking so badly she nearly dropped the light. The sound had come from the study. When she reached the door, she hesitated, gripping the handle as fear rooted her in place. Finally, summoning all her courage, she pushed the door open. The room was in disarray, books and papers scattered across the floor. The mirror that had hung above the desk was shattered, shards of glass glinting like malevolent stars in the beam of her flashlight. Julia's breath caught as she noticed something on the largest remaining fragment of glass. Her reflection, staring back at her with wide, terrified eyes. It wasn't just a reflection. It was moving independently, its lips forming words she couldn't hear. Then, as if sensing her attention, the reflection smiled, a slow, chilling expression that sent a shiver down her spine. Julia stumbled back, her foot crunching on broken glass. The reflection mouthed something again, and this time she could hear it, faint but unmistakable. "You can't hide from us?" The shard went dark, her reflection vanishing as though it had never been there. Julia fled the room, her mind spinning with questions. She thought the box had been the source of the evil, but the house itself seemed to hold deeper, more insidious secrets. And as she returned to her bedroom, a new, horrifying thought took root in her mind. What if the box wasn't the only thing that had been disturbed? The morning after the incident with the mirror, Julia felt a lingering sense of dread that clung to her like a heavy cloak. She barely managed to make breakfast, each step through the kitchen a forced motion, her thoughts consumed by the events of the previous night. Her eyes kept darting to the corners of the room, as if expecting something to emerge from the shadows. Max and Emma, despite their best efforts to pretend things were normal, looked exhausted. Max, who normally had an insatiable curiosity, remained unusually quiet. Emma, on the other hand, seemed to be hyper-aware of every creak and groan of the house, her gaze flickering constantly toward the doors and windows. Julia felt guilty for not being able to protect them from this creeping terror. "You should go outside today," Julia suggested, trying to sound more confident than she felt. "Get some fresh air. Maybe take a walk to the pond." Emma frowned but nodded. "Okay, Mom, but I don't like being here alone." Julia forced a smile. "I'll stay in the study. I won't be far." The moment they left, Julia's sense of unease intensified. The house was silent again, but it was the kind of silence that felt unnatural, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. The strange, unsettling noises had become more frequent, more insistent. Small things like the ticking of clocks that had long stopped, or the occasional soft rustling from behind the walls. She had dismissed these sounds before, attributing them to the house settling, but now she wondered if they weren't so innocent. Sitting in the study, Julia tried to focus on the journal she had been reading, but her mind kept drifting back to the mirror, the whispering reflections, and the chilling message it had delivered. Her fingers trembled as she turned the pages, trying to find any clue that might help her understand what was happening. The entries about the box were troubling enough, but there were other references too. References to things that lived within and echoes that hunger for the past. At first, Julia didn't understand. She thought it referred to the house, the cursed land perhaps, but the more she read, the more she realized it was speaking about something far more sinister. A presence that inhabited the house. Something far older and more malevolent than she had imagined. The box might have been the trigger, but it wasn't the only thing awakening in the house. The land itself seemed to be alive, as though it had been waiting for something to stir it from its slumber. The thought that the house could be more than just a vessel for evil sent a shiver down Julia's spine. It seemed absurd, impossible, even. But as she read the journal's cryptic descriptions, she couldn't shake the feeling that the walls were watching her. Then, without warning, a sudden thud sounded from the hallway outside the study. Julia froze, her breath catching in her throat. It was followed by another thud, this one closer, as though something or someone was moving within the walls themselves. The silence that followed was oppressive, like the calm before a storm. Julia stood slowly, her heart pounding in her chest. The sound came again, louder this time. She approached the wall closest to her, her hand trembling as she pressed her palm against the cold plaster. It was like the house itself was alive, breathing in time with her. The noise was unmistakable now, scratching, scraping, as if something was trying to escape from within the walls. Terrified, Julia backed away and grabbed the flashlight she kept on her desk. The walls seemed to pulse with a low, menacing hum, as if responding to her fear. She aimed the beam of light along the seams of the walls, looking for any sign of a crack or break, but there was nothing. The walls were solid, no visible signs of damage, yet the sounds were becoming louder and more frantic. Her mind raced with possibilities. Could it be the remnants of the box, still calling out? Or was there something else, something that had been here long before they arrived? Julia didn't know, but she couldn't ignore it any longer. She had to investigate. The scraping sounds intensified as she moved into the hallway, each step a hesitant echo. The temperature seemed to drop as she passed beneath the old portraits lining the walls, their eyes following her with unnerving precision. She reached the first door, the one that led to the basement, and it was from there that the noise seemed to originate. With a sinking feeling in her stomach, Julia reached for the door handle. It turned easily, but as she stepped into the dimly lit space below, the air thickened, and a wave of nausea washed over her. The basement was colder than it had been before, the familiar shadows now stretching unnaturally along the walls. And then, amidst the silence, Julia heard it, an unmistakable whisper, barely audible, but unmistakable in its urgency. "Come closer." Julia's heart raced. She had no idea whether the voice was in her head or something far more terrifying. She had never felt more alone in her life. But she had to find the source of the noise. She had to understand what was happening in this house. And so, with shaking hands and a sense of dread that pulled at her very soul, she descended further into the darkness. The basement was colder than Julia remembered. The temperature seemed to drop with each step she took, the chill crawling beneath her skin, sinking deep into her bones. As she descended the stairs, her flashlight flickered, casting strange shadows that stretched and writhed across the stone walls. She paused at the bottom of the staircase, breathing in the musty air, the scent of mildew and damp earth thick in her nostrils. The faint whisper that had called her here still lingered, echoing in her mind. "Come closer." The words were soft, yet filled with an undeniable command. She hesitated, her heart hammering in her chest, but something within her pushed her forward. Perhaps it was the overwhelming need to understand, to finally get to the heart of the terror that had been haunting her family since their arrival. Or perhaps it was the strange, almost magnetic pull of the house itself, urging her onward. Whatever it was, it felt like she had no choice but to follow the voice. The basement was vast, far larger than she had imagined. The stone walls stretched out in all directions, and the ceiling was low, casting an oppressive sense of confinement. The room was filled with old furniture covered in dusty sheets, abandoned relics from previous owners. But it was what lay in the far corner of the room that drew her attention. There, partially hidden behind a large wardrobe, was an old wooden door, its edges worn and cracked. The door was slightly ajar, and a faint light flickered from within. Julia approached it cautiously, her flashlight sweeping across the floor, revealing broken glass and shattered pottery that crunched beneath her feet. She was aware of the oppressive silence around her, save for the soft murmur that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. It was as though the house was alive, breathing, waiting. Her hand reached for the door handle, and as she touched it, a sudden jolt of electricity shot through her fingertips. The sensation was sharp, almost painful, but it was the unmistakable feeling of something otherworldly, something ancient, reaching out to her. With a deep breath, she pushed the door open. The room beyond the door was small and dimly lit, the air heavy with the scent of old wood and dust. Julia's flashlight swept over the contents of the room. Shelves filled with ancient books, jars of unknown substances, and strange symbols etched into the walls. But it was the center of the room that caught her attention. At the far end, in the center of a raised stone platform, was a large, ornate mirror. It was different from the others in the house. This one was cracked, the glass dark and cloudy, yet it exuded an unnatural presence. Julia felt drawn to it, as though it was beckoning her closer. Her heart raced in her chest, a mix of fear and fascination compelling her to approach. The moment she stepped closer to the mirror, the temperature in the room dropped even further. The air was thick, stifling, and the whispering grew louder in her ears, now unmistakably angry, as if urging her to leave, to turn away. But Julia could not tear her eyes away from the mirror. As her reflection slowly came into focus, it seemed to distort. Her image in the glass was no longer quite right. Her face appeared pale, gaunt, her eyes sunken and hollow. And then, with a sickening lurch, the reflection smiled, a cold, malevolent grin that stretched far too wide, too unnaturally wide. Julia gasped, stumbling back, but the reflection remained fixed, watching her with an intensity that made her stomach turn. "Julia," the voice came again, no longer a whisper, but a deep, guttural tone that seemed to echo from the depths of the earth. "You shouldn't have come here." Julia's blood ran cold as the reflection's smile widened even further, its eyes locking onto hers. The house itself seemed to tremble, the walls groaning as if the very foundation was being shaken. The air was suffocating, and the whispering from the walls reached a deafening crescendo, each voice overlapping, a cacophony of madness. With a surge of adrenaline, Julia turned and fled from the room, the echo of the voice chasing her as she ascended the stairs in a blind panic. She burst back into the main basement area, her pulse racing, her mind reeling. The door slammed shut behind her with a force that shook the floor, and the house fell eerily silent once more. Julia pressed her back against the wall, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Her head spun, and the images of the mirror, that smile, were burned into her mind. What had she seen? Was it the house playing tricks on her, or something more? The house was alive. She had to accept that now. And it wanted her family, to remain. It had called them here, had seduced them with promises of comfort, of a fresh start, only to reveal its true nature once they were trapped within its walls. The question was no longer about how to escape, it was about whether they even could. And in that moment, Julia realized the horrifying truth. The house wasn't just haunting them, it was feeding on them. The night after Julia's encounter in the basement was one of the longest of her life. She lay awake in bed, her mind racing with the horrifying images of the mirror, the grotesque reflection that had smiled at her with such malevolence. The air in the house felt thicker now, as if the walls themselves were closing in, suffocating her. She could hear the faintest creaks from upstairs, the soft whisper of the house settling. Or perhaps it was something else, a reminder that she was not alone. She had tried to sleep, but the weight of what she had seen and heard kept her from resting. The voice, "You shouldn't have come here," echoed relentlessly in her mind. Was it the house speaking? Or something deeper, something more ancient, using the house as a vessel? Julia felt she was on the verge of a terrible revelation, one that might offer the key to their survival, or seal their doom. Max and Emma were unaware of what had transpired in the basement. Julia had decided to keep the details to herself for now. She didn't want to frighten them, didn't want to admit that the house had already begun to exert its influence over them. The last thing she needed was for her family to see the fear in her eyes. If they realized how close they were to losing control of the situation, they would panic. And she couldn't afford panic. Not now. The following morning, after a restless night, Julia decided she had no choice but to seek answers. She had to understand what had happened in the basement, and more importantly, what the house wanted from them. She couldn't keep running in fear. She had to confront whatever darkness lurked within the walls of this place. With a steely resolve, Julia went back to the study. The journal had to hold some clue. The previous entries about the box and the strange references to echoes hadn't fully made sense to her, but there was something there, something she had missed. She pulled the journal from the shelf and flipped through the pages, each one filled with cryptic notes and unsettling observations. It was then that she noticed something she hadn't seen before. A sketch, drawn in great detail, showed the very layout of the house. But there was something wrong with it. The drawing was old, its edges yellowed and frayed, and in the center of the page was an area that didn't match the house's actual floor plan. A hidden room, its door marked with strange symbols. The room was located directly beneath the staircase that led to the second floor, right beneath where they had found the box. Her pulse quickened. This hidden room hadn't appeared in any of the plans or blueprints they had received when buying the house. It was as if it had been intentionally omitted. Or worse, as if it had been forgotten. Why would the previous owners leave out such an important part of the house? What had they known? Determined to uncover the truth, Julia set down the journal and began her search. She checked every corner of the house, every room, looking for any signs of the hidden entrance. But there was nothing. The walls remained solid, unyielding. After hours of searching, she began to doubt the map's validity. Perhaps it was a relic from another time, a drawing of a long-abandoned space that no longer existed. But just as she was about to give up, she noticed something strange in the corner of the kitchen, beneath the floorboards. A faint crack, barely visible, running along the wood. She knelt down, her hands trembling as she pried the boards apart, revealing a narrow gap beneath the floor. The air smelled musty, and a draft seemed to emanate from the darkness below. With a growing sense of unease, Julia pulled away more floorboards, revealing an old metal trapdoor. It was small, covered in rust, but unmistakable. The same strange symbols from the sketch were etched into its surface. A chill ran down her spine as she stared at the door, the whispers of the house seeming to intensify in her ears. There was no turning back now. With one final, trembling breath, Julia lifted the door. The air that rushed up from below was thick, heavier than before, as though it had been sealed away for a long time. She shined the flashlight down into the abyss. The stairwell led into an underground passage, its walls lined with the same symbols as the trapdoor. The passage was narrow and winding, disappearing into the dark. Julia hesitated for only a moment before stepping inside. The stairs creaked beneath her weight as she descended into the unknown. The further she went, the darker it became, until the light from her flashlight barely illuminated the path ahead. It was as if the darkness itself was swallowing her whole. The deeper she went, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. And then, at the end of the passage, she saw it. A door, much like the one in the basement, stood in her path. It was ancient, covered in dust and cobwebs, yet somehow still intact. The same symbols, the same markings. As she approached, she felt the unmistakable presence of something watching her, a malevolent force that had been waiting for this moment. Julia reached for the door handle, and as she touched it, the air around her seemed to shift. She was no longer alone. The door creaked open, and Julia stepped inside. What lay beyond would be more than she was ready for. The truth at last was waiting, but whether it would set them free or damn them forever, she didn't know. When Julia stepped through the door, the world seemed to shift beneath her feet. She had expected darkness, as the passageway had suggested, but instead, she found herself in a room that was impossibly vast. The space stretched beyond her sight, its dimensions unquantifiable. It felt as though the room had no walls, no boundaries, just an infinite blackness that swallowed every corner. The only light came from her flashlight, its beam weak and flickering as though hesitant to illuminate the depth of what lay before her. As she moved deeper into the room, she could feel the temperature drop sharply. It wasn't a chill, not in the traditional sense, but a creeping cold that seeped into her bones, numbing her to the core. She shivered despite herself, the oppressive atmosphere suffocating her. The walls, or at least what appeared to be the walls, were lined with symbols similar to those she had seen throughout the house. Ancient, cryptic, and indecipherable, they pulsed with a dark energy. Julia felt the weight of the house's history pressing down on her. It was as if the very foundation of the building was intertwined with the malevolent force that lingered here. The symbols seemed to shift and twist as she moved, their shapes altering just enough to make her doubt her own senses. Was this an illusion, a trick of the mind? Or was it something else entirely? Something that existed beyond her understanding? The room, despite its vastness, felt claustrophobic. It was as if it were alive, responding to her presence. The deeper she ventured, the more it seemed to close in around her, as though the house itself were pushing her forward. She had come this far, and there was no turning back now. But even as her resolve held, she felt a growing sense of dread creeping through her veins. What was waiting for her here? Suddenly, the air shifted again. The faintest sound, soft like a whisper, drifted through the vast space. Julia's heart skipped a beat. She stopped, straining her ears, but the sound had already faded, leaving only the oppressive silence. She scanned the room, her flashlight casting wild shadows across the walls. For a moment, she thought she saw something move in the periphery of her vision. Just a flicker, a dark shape, but when she turned, it was gone. Focus, she told herself. Keep going. She continued forward, her steps slow and deliberate. The further she ventured, the more the feeling of being watched intensified. It wasn't just her mind playing tricks on her. She could feel the weight of eyes unseen, hidden in the darkness, yet ever present. Something was here with her, something that had been waiting for her. Julia's breath quickened as the oppressive energy grew heavier. It was as though the room itself was alive, aware of her presence, pushing her towards something, some terrible truth. Then in the distance she saw it. At first it was just a shape, a silhouette standing against the inky blackness. But as she drew closer, it became clearer. It was a figure, tall and unnaturally thin, standing perfectly still. Its outline was blurred, shifting like smoke, but there was something unmistakably wrong about it. Its very presence seemed to distort the air around it. Julia's pulse raced, and her stomach churned. She wanted to turn back, to run, but her legs felt frozen, as though the very ground beneath her feet had become a trap. When she was only a few feet away, the figure moved. It didn't walk, it simply shifted, like a shadow sliding across the ground. The movement was fluid and unnatural, its form stretching and contracting in impossible ways. Julia gasped in horror, stumbling backward. The figure raised a hand, and a voice, no, not a voice, but a presence, whispered in her mind. You should not have come here. The words were clear, resonating deep within her, not spoken aloud but felt as though the very air around her had formed them. She staggered, her heart hammering in her chest, the room spinning around her. It was as if the walls themselves were breathing, the symbols on the walls throbbing with an otherworldly pulse. The figure seemed to draw closer, its presence growing stronger, its form more defined, until it was standing directly before her. But it was not the figure that terrified Julia most. It was the realization that she knew it. The face, although distorted and warped by shadows, was unmistakable. It was her own. Her mind reeled, confusion and terror twisting her thoughts into incoherence. How could this be? This was impossible. She had seen herself reflected in the mirror, but this was different. This was not a reflection, not a shadow of herself. This was something else, something twisted, something that should not exist. The house has claimed you. The figure spoke again, this time with an unmistakable clarity. You are part of it now. Your past, your present. It is all here, bound by the darkness. It cannot be undone. Julia's breath caught in her throat. The weight of the figure's words sank into her like a stone, the finality of its statement ringing in her ears. This was more than just a haunted house. This was something older, something far more powerful. And the house hadn't just claimed her, it had claimed all of them. As the figure reached out, its hand cold and clammy, Julia's vision blurred, and everything around her began to fade. The walls, the symbols, the figure. It all melted away, leaving only an overwhelming, suffocating void. Then, with a violent jolt, everything stopped. The room, the figure, and the whispering presence were gone. Julia stood alone in the darkness, the cold still pressing in on her. She could hear nothing, feel nothing, only the steady beat of her heart. But she knew, deep within her, that the house had marked them all. It had not merely been waiting for her, it had been waiting for all of them. And now it would take what it had come for. The truth was clear. There was no escaping the mansion now. The awakening had already begun. Julia's mind reeled as she stumbled away from the impossible figure. The air felt thicker now, more oppressive, as though it carried the weight of unspeakable knowledge. She had seen her own reflection, or something close to it, in the shadowy depths of the mansion. Her stomach churned, and she could still hear the echo of its voice, its words resonating in her mind. The house has claimed you. There was no doubt anymore. The house was not just a building. It was alive, hungry, and it had been waiting for them. The further Julia moved through the dark, the more disoriented she became. The mansion no longer followed any logical pattern. The hallway she had entered from now seemed to stretch impossibly far, and the walls closed in around her, their surfaces slick and cold, covered with symbols she couldn't comprehend. Every corner she turned only revealed more of the same disorienting emptiness. The house had somehow warped itself, turning into an endless maze that defied any attempt at understanding. Her flashlight flickered once again, casting long, dancing shadows along the walls. It was as if the darkness itself was alive, shifting and twisting with malicious intent. The symbols on the walls pulsed, almost as though they were waiting for her to decipher them. She felt a rising urgency within her, a desperate need to uncover the truth, though part of her dreaded what that truth might be. What had the figure meant when it said that she had been claimed? What would the house do next? In her fog of panic, Julia had almost forgotten the others. It wasn't until she heard a faint cry, barely audible, that she snapped back to her senses. The sound came from further down the corridor, a desperate, high-pitched wail that cut through the air like a knife. Instinctively, she followed it, each step growing heavier, each breath more labored. Her heart was pounding in her chest, and yet she felt drawn to the source of the sound, as if the mansion itself were pulling her forward. The wail grew louder as Julia hurried down the hallway, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She rounded a corner and found herself in a dimly lit room. At first, she couldn't make sense of what she was seeing. The space was a small, cluttered chamber, filled with strange objects. A broken mirror, an overturned chair, a collection of old books piled haphazardly on the floor. The air in here felt different, as though it had been sealed off from the rest of the house. But it wasn't the room that held her attention. It was the figure in the center. Standing before her was her sister Emma. At least Julia thought it was Emma. The woman in front of her was pale and gaunt, her eyes wide with terror. She was crouched in the middle of the room, her hands clutching at her hair as if trying to hold herself together. Her body trembled with fear, her clothes torn and stained with dirt. The sight was so jarring, so unnatural, that Julia's mind struggled to reconcile the image before her with the vibrant, confident woman she had known. "Emma," Julia called, her voice wavering. The woman's head snapped up, and for a moment, her face was filled with recognition. But it wasn't Emma's face, not entirely. There was something wrong with it. The skin was too smooth, too still. It seemed as though the very contours of her face had been molded, reshaped, until it was no longer a familiar reflection. And then, as quickly as it had appeared, the expression of recognition vanished, replaced by a blank, hollow stare. "You shouldn't have come," the figure said in Emma's voice, though it was hollow, like an echo from deep within the house. Julia stepped back, her breath catching in her throat. "What is this? What's happening to you?" But the figure said nothing more. Instead, it began to convulse, its movements jerky and unnatural, as though it were struggling against some invisible force. Julia's mind raced. This wasn't Emma. It couldn't be. It was a shadow, a distorted version of her sister, one that had been corrupted by the house. But why? What had it done to her? Was she the only one left unaffected by whatever malice had claimed this place? Before Julia could ask another question, the figure collapsed, its body falling to the ground with a sickening thud. It lay motionless, but Julia knew better than to approach it. The room had grown even colder, and the shadows seemed to lengthen, twisting and coiling around her like a physical presence. There was no escape from the dark grip of the house. Her mind flashed back to the moment when she had seen her own reflection in the shadowy figure. "The house has claimed you." The words echoed in her mind, over and over again. It wasn't just Emma, it was everyone. They had all been marked by the house, all drawn into its dark web, and there was no escaping it. In the distance, Julia could hear more noises, scraping, scurrying sounds that seemed to come from all directions. She turned toward the source of the noise and froze. A faint, distorted voice whispered her name. It wasn't Emma's voice. It wasn't anyone's voice. It was the voice of the house calling to her, demanding her attention, claiming her once again. She was trapped. The price for uncovering the house's secrets had already been paid. The mansion had taken its toll, and it wasn't done yet. Julia's body shook with dread as she realized the horrifying truth. They were all part of the house now, bound to it in ways she couldn't yet understand, their fate sealed by the terrible price of the secrets they had uncovered. The house had awakened, and with it, its hunger. It would not rest until it had consumed them all. In the days that followed Julia's harrowing discovery, the mansion seemed to grow quieter. The oppressive atmosphere that had clung to the walls, heavy with the tension of 1,000 unspoken words, began to settle like a thick fog. Yet this silence was not comforting. It was suffocating. The air felt thick with expectation, as if the house itself was waiting for something, a signal, a moment to strike. Julia couldn't shake the sensation that the mansion was aware of her every move, watching, listening, plotting. Even the creaking of the old floorboards seemed to echo with deliberate intent. Despite the lack of any immediate physical threat, Julia was unable to return to her previous routine. She had once been able to walk through the mansion's many rooms, tracing the worn paths with a sense of cautious curiosity. Now, she felt a suffocating dread every time she entered a new space. Her eyes would dart nervously to the shadows, as if expecting something to leap out from the corners. Each day seemed to drag on longer, the house twisting itself around her sense of time. The long, quiet moments in between the strange occurrences felt more disorienting than the bursts of terror. The others, her family, once close and unified, had retreated into their own private spaces, each seemingly lost to their own thoughts, fears, and increasingly paranoid behaviors. Sarah, her mother, spent hours in front of the broken mirror in the sitting room, staring at her reflection with a fixed, hollow expression, as though the glass held the answers to questions she was too afraid to ask. Her father, once so firm and confident, was now distant and distracted, his gaze often vacant as he stood by the windows, as if waiting for something or someone. The house had worked its way into their minds, slowly eroding their will to resist. But it was Emma's disappearance that gnawed at Julia the most. The moment she had witnessed her sister's strange, twisted form lying motionless in the middle of the room had been burned into her memory. She had seen the hollow look in Emma's eyes, heard her voice distorted beyond recognition, and yet Emma had vanished before she could gather her wits to act. No one had seen her since, and her absence was marked by an oppressive weight that hung over the house like a dark cloud. The mansion itself offered no clues. There were no signs of a struggle, no traces of Emma's presence to follow. The walls remained as they had always been, silent and unyielding. It was as though the house had swallowed her whole. Julia found herself waking up in the dead of night, her mind racing with thoughts of Emma. Was she still alive? Or had she become yet another victim of the mansion's insatiable hunger? It wasn't until Julia ventured deeper into the house, to the lower level she had been warned to avoid, that she began to uncover hints of the truth. The basement, once a forgotten part of the mansion, now felt like the beating heart of the house itself. The walls were damp with the remnants of decades of neglect, the air thick with mildew and decay. But in the far corner, beneath a pile of old, rotting furniture, Julia found something unexpected: a journal. It was old, its leather cover cracked and worn, and its pages yellowed with age. As her fingers skimmed over the ink, she began to understand the terrible history of the house. The journal belonged to the mansion's original owner, a man by the name of Edmund Harker. His entries were disturbingly cryptic, filled with references to rituals, experiments, and a deep, almost worshipful obsession with the house itself. Harker wrote about the mansion as though it were a living entity, something more than just bricks and wood. He described it as a vessel that needed to be fed. The house, it seemed, was not merely a structure. It was a parasite, alive with its own dark purpose. And the price for living within it, for disturbing its delicate balance, was far steeper than anyone could have imagined. Julia read on in horror, her hands trembling as she turned the pages. Harker's writings became increasingly erratic as time went on. He spoke of the house's ability to claim its inhabitants, twisting them into something unrecognizable, stripping them of their very identities. He warned of the danger in staying too long, and yet it seemed as though he had been unable to leave himself. He had become a prisoner within his own creation, bound to it in ways he could not escape. As Julia closed the journal, a heavy realization settled in her chest. The house was not simply haunted. It was a living entity, feeding on the minds and souls of those who dared to enter it. There was no escape from it, no safe place to hide. The house had claimed them all, and now, as she stood alone in the cold, dark basement, Julia understood that the longer they stayed, the more they would become like the others, shadows of their former selves, bound to the house for eternity. In a fit of panic, Julia rushed back to the main floor, her heart pounding in her chest. She had to warn the others, but when she reached the sitting room, she found only an empty chair. Her parents were gone. The house had claimed them too. The silence was unbearable, suffocating her as though the very walls were closing in. Julia was alone, truly alone for the first time since they had moved into the mansion. And then, from somewhere deep within the mansion, she heard it, a sound so faint at first that she questioned whether it was real. It was a whisper, distant and barely audible, but it was unmistakable. Her name, Julia. The house was calling to her. The price of the secrets it held was clear now. There would be no escape. Not for her, not for anyone. The mansion had already begun to claim its next victim. In the wake of the terrifying realization that her family had vanished, Julia found herself standing at the edge of something far darker than she had ever imagined. The mansion, once a place of intrigue, had become her personal prison, its hallways stretching on endlessly like an unnatural maze. Her mind had become a tangle of confusion, grief, and a mounting sense of dread, yet the more she tried to understand what was happening, the more the mansion seemed to slip further from her grasp. The journal had offered glimpses of the horrors that had once claimed the mansion's previous inhabitants, but now it was clear. The house was still active, still feeding, still reaching for something deeper. Julia's body seemed to move on autopilot as she wandered the corridors, her eyes scanning every darkened corner, every shadowed nook. She had tried the front door, only to find it locked, as it always had been. No matter how hard she pushed or pulled, it remained immovable. The windows were no better, solid, impenetrable glass that offered no escape, only the distant view of the overgrown grounds outside. The house had become a cage, and Julia was its unwilling occupant. The heavy silence that had once gripped the mansion was now a constant companion, pressing in on her from all sides, suffocating her thoughts. Her mind raced with the terrifying thought that perhaps there was no escape, that her family had already been consumed by the house, their souls trapped forever in its twisted framework. But there was something even more terrifying lurking beneath this fear. What if she, too, was being drawn into its insidious grip? What if, like her parents and Emma, she was already beginning to lose herself? It was then that Julia began to notice the changes. At first, they were subtle, a flicker in the corner of her eye, a sound that she couldn't quite place. But as the days wore on, they grew more pronounced. It started with the walls themselves. The wallpaper, once faded but unremarkable, now seemed to shift before her eyes. Patterns in the designs twisted and contorted, rearranging themselves into grotesque, unfamiliar shapes. Her footsteps, echoing through the corridors, no longer seemed to belong to her. There was a distinct feeling of being followed, as though an unseen presence hovered just behind her, its breath cold against her neck. Julia tried to reach out for something, anything that might explain the phenomenon, but there were no answers, only more questions. Her mind, once sharp and clear, now seemed fogged, clouded by the overwhelming sensations the house fed into her. It was as though the mansion was slowly taking hold of her thoughts, its influence seeping into her very being. She would find herself standing still, staring blankly at the same painting for hours, or wandering the rooms without any memory of how she had arrived there. Time itself seemed to warp within the house, minutes stretching into hours, days blurring together. Desperation led her to the library, where she had first discovered the journal. Perhaps there was more to uncover, something that could explain the madness surrounding her. The shelves were filled with dust and forgotten knowledge, but as Julia moved between them, something peculiar happened. A strange energy seemed to pulse in the air. The room felt warmer, the oppressive chill that had filled the house for so long momentarily lifting. A voice, faint but unmistakable, echoed through her mind. "You are not alone." Julia recoiled, the words sinking deep into her bones. The voice was not her own, nor was it the voice of her family. It was foreign, ancient, as though it came from somewhere beyond the walls of the mansion itself. She scanned the room, her breath catching in her throat, but the space remained empty. She was alone, yet the feeling of being watched was unbearable. It was as if every book, every object in the room, was aware of her presence, studying her, waiting. It was then that she noticed the hidden compartment beneath one of the bookshelves. A small, metal latch sat just beneath the dust, barely noticeable. Her heart skipped a beat. She had passed the shelf countless times, never giving it a second thought, but now it called to her. She knelt before it, hands shaking as she pulled at the latch, the sound of metal grinding against metal filling the air. A narrow drawer slid open, revealing a collection of brittle papers and a small, weathered box. The box was plain, its surface worn smooth by time, but as Julia lifted it, a sense of dread flooded her chest. She felt as though she were holding something far more dangerous than a mere artifact. Her fingers trembling, she opened the box. Inside, there was a photograph. The black and white image depicted a group of people, strangers to Julia, standing before a grand, ornate house, the very mansion she had come to fear. The faces in the photograph were smiling, but their eyes were vacant, empty of life. A chill ran down Julia's spine as she realized that she recognized some of the faces. One of them was Emma, another, her father. The photograph seemed to be from a time long before their arrival at the mansion, yet it was unmistakable. They were already a part of it. Julia's breath caught in her throat as the reality hit her. The house wasn't just claiming its inhabitants, it was rewiring their very essence, trapping them in an eternal cycle. It didn't matter when they had arrived. The mansion had already laid its claim. It was as though it had been waiting for them, carefully orchestrating their fates long before they stepped foot inside. In that moment, Julia understood the true horror of the mansion. It was not just a place. It was a force, an entity with a mind of its own, weaving the lives of those who entered into its web, pulling them deeper and deeper until they were no longer recognizable. The house had already begun to erase her, piece by piece. And no matter how much she resisted, no matter how hard she tried to escape, she knew now that it was only a matter of time before she, too, would become part of its endless, consuming history. She slammed the box shut, her heart pounding as the weight of her realization sank in. There was no going back. The mansion had already won. The only question now was how long she could hold on before she, too, was lost to it forever. The night stretched on, dark and endless, As Julia's understanding of the mansion grew deeper, its cold walls pressing in against her sanity. The revelation she had uncovered in the library about the photograph had shattered any remaining sense of security she had clung to. There was no escaping this place. No matter how hard she tried to reason with herself, she couldn't ignore the growing certainty that the mansion had already begun to consume her. Her family's disappearance, the unsettling sounds that echoed through the halls, the shifting walls. These were not coincidences, but the machinations of something far older, far more malevolent. The mansion had a history, one that no one had ever bothered to uncover. And now, with each passing hour, Julia found herself unraveling its twisted past, piece by piece. She had once thought that the family she had moved here to escape to could offer her safety and solace, but now it seemed like a cruel joke. Her parents had vanished, swallowed by the very fabric of the house itself, and Emma was no better off. Julia had found her journal, a haunting account of experiences and perceptions that twisted in on themselves until Emma's reality was unrecognizable. But where had Emma gone? Where had her parents disappeared to? The mansion seemed to have the answers, yet no answers at all. There was one thing Julia couldn't shake from her mind, though, a terrifying thought that wouldn't leave her. The photograph of Emma, her father, and the strangers smiling before the mansion was a chilling confirmation of what she had already feared. The mansion had known them before they had known it. It had been waiting for them, manipulating their arrival, choosing them. The mansion had claimed its first victims long before Julia and her family arrived. It was a predator lying in wait, drawing them into its web, and now it was coming for her. Her search for answers had led her to the basement, the final frontier in the mansion's labyrinthine depths. The damp, musty air in the lower levels felt heavy and thick, like the weight of forgotten secrets. Her footsteps echoed louder here, as if the house itself were amplifying her every movement, reminding her that she was not alone. She hesitated at the door to the basement, a thick wooden structure that groaned ominously in the silence. Her instinct screamed at her to turn away, but something inside her, perhaps a last thread of defiance, compelled her to move forward. It felt like the only place left to search. Inside the basement, Julia was met with a sight that could only be described as unnatural. The stone walls were lined with old, rotting crates and barrels, the remnants of a forgotten era. But amidst the debris, there was a large, circular table in the center of the room, its surface covered with yellowed papers and odd symbols. In the dim light, Julia could barely make out the intricate carvings etched into the walls, symbols that resembled ancient, long-forgotten languages. Her heart raced as she approached the table, and her hands shook when she saw what lay upon it. A book, old and weathered, its pages curling at the edges, was open to a page covered in more of the strange symbols. Julia recognized some of the words, but they made no sense to her. As she leaned closer, the air grew colder, and she could feel something pulling at the edges of her consciousness, tugging her toward the page. There was a faint, whispering sound, just on the edge of her hearing, as though the house itself was speaking to her. "You have come," just as it predicted. The voice was not physical. It was in her mind, not something she could hear with her ears, but something that resonated deep within her, like a dark echo. Julia stepped back, her pulse quickening. The whisper seemed to grow louder, its presence overpowering her thoughts. She had to get away, but as she turned to leave, something stopped her, a vision, not of the present, but of the past. The basement floor rippled before her eyes, the walls distorting as though she were seeing through time itself. She saw shadows moving, figures dressed in old, dark clothing. They were gathered around the table she stood before, chanting in low, guttural tones. The symbols on the walls came alive in the vision, glowing faintly, as if they were imbued with a power that had not yet been fully realized. And in the center of the circle, there was something, not a person, but something else, something that twisted in on itself, its form shifting and stretching, a mass of darkness that pulsed with an unnatural rhythm. Julia gasped and stumbled back. The vision faded as quickly as it had come, but the terror it instilled in her remained. She understood now. The mansion had not merely been built here. It had been summoned, created, bound by forces older than time itself. And the people who had come before her? They hadn't been victims. They had been participants, part of a dark ritual that spanned centuries, each generation feeding the house, contributing to its power. The mansion was alive, and it had been growing for far longer than Julia could comprehend. It had been waiting for her. Shaken, Julia turned and fled the basement, her footsteps echoing in the empty hallways as though the house was chasing her. Her mind raced, her thoughts crashing together like a flood, trying to make sense of the visions, the whispers, and the symbols. What had she seen? What had she learned? And what did it mean for her and the remnants of her family? As she returned to the main floor, Julia noticed something new, something that hadn't been there before. A door, one she had never seen, stood at the far end of the hallway. It was small, inconspicuous, and yet it seemed to glow with an eerie light, as if it were calling to her. Julia's hand trembled as she approached it, the cold wood beneath her fingers a stark contrast to the warmth of the house that had once felt like home. She hesitated, but only for a moment. The mansion had already taken so much from her, her family, her peace of mind, and now, perhaps even her soul. She had no choice but to open the door. She pushed it gently, the creaking hinges announcing her arrival. What lay beyond the door, Julia had no way of knowing. But as the light from within spilled into the hallway, casting long, sinister shadows, she understood that this was the final test. The house had led her here, and she was about to come face to face with whatever it had been preparing for her all along. The light from beyond the door spilled into the hallway like an invitation, yet it felt more like a trap. Julia stood frozen, her hands still resting on the cold, unyielding wood. There was something about the way the light flickered, erratic like the heartbeat of something alive. The room beyond was shrouded in shadows, but the eerie glow was undeniable, a strange contrast to the surrounding darkness of the mansion. A part of Julia wanted to turn back, to retreat into the safety of the familiar rooms, but another part of her, something darker, urged her forward. There was no escaping the house anymore. It had already chosen her. She pushed the door open, the hinges groaning in protest as if they were reluctant to reveal the secrets within. The room beyond was small, scarcely more than a closet in size, yet it felt vast in its oppressive silence. The air was thick with dust, and the scent of something ancient clung to the walls. Julia's breath caught in her throat as her eyes adjusted to the dim light. The room was lined with shelves, each one filled with objects that looked like relics from another age. Old books, tarnished trinkets, strange jars filled with liquid that shimmered in the half-light. All of it seemed to have been preserved for centuries, untouched by time. In the center of the room stood a pedestal, on which rested a large, ornate box. It was covered in intricate carvings, symbols that Julia couldn't begin to comprehend. The box seemed to pulse with a life of its own, its presence overwhelming in its intensity. It called to her, not with words, but with a deep, primal pull that she could not ignore. The air around her seemed to grow heavier with each passing second, thickening like a fog that clouded her thoughts and made her feel as though she were suffocating. The longer she stood there, the more she felt herself slipping away, becoming part of the mansion, part of its dark, suffocating history. Julia approached the pedestal slowly, as though moving through molasses. Her hand reached out, trembling, toward the box. The moment her fingers brushed against the cold surface, a jolt of electricity shot through her, a surge of energy so intense it made her recoil. The light flickered, then dimmed, and the room seemed to shift around her, its walls breathing, expanding and contracting like a living organism. The symbols on the box glowed faintly, their meaning still a mystery, but now they felt more familiar, as if they were beckoning her to understand something she had long forgotten. A low, resonant hum filled the air, the sound coming from deep within the walls, the floor, and even the very foundation of the mansion itself. It was a sound unlike any she had ever heard, an ancient, sorrowful noise that made her heart ache with a deep, visceral pain. It seemed to reverberate through her bones, vibrating in her chest, as if the house itself were mourning something lost long ago. But what was it mourning? What had happened here, in this place, that had left such a mark on the fabric of time? Julia stumbled back from the pedestal, her mind reeling. The mansion had always felt like a living, breathing entity, but now it was undeniable. It was alive, in a way that transcended human understanding. The photographs she had found in the library, the whispers in the walls, the strange dreams that had plagued her since her arrival. None of it made sense, but it was all connected. The house had been waiting for her, preparing her for something that she could not yet comprehend. The box seemed to hum louder, its call growing more insistent. Julia had to know what was inside, but at the same time, a part of her recoiled at the thought. She had always been cautious, rational even in the face of terror, but now the lines between logic and madness had blurred. She was standing on the precipice of something far greater than herself, something that threatened to consume her whole. It was a choice between understanding and madness, between unveiling the truth and losing herself to the darkness. As her mind struggled to grasp the enormity of what was happening, a sudden movement caught her eye. The door behind her, the one she had just entered through, had closed silently. It had been ajar moments ago, yet now it was sealed, as though it had never been opened at all. The mansion had locked her in, trapping her with whatever horrors lay within the box, and there was no way out. The realization hit her like a cold wave. She was part of this now, woven into the very fabric of the house. She had crossed a threshold that could not be undone. Her pulse quickened as she returned her gaze to the box. It was no longer just an object. It was a puzzle, a key, a symbol of everything that had happened to her and her family. The mansion had not just claimed them, it had shaped them, molded them into something else. This box, she realized, held the final piece of the puzzle. But would she survive its revelation? Would anyone? As Julia reached for the box again, the room seemed to tilt, the walls warping and stretching. Her vision blurred, and the world around her began to fragment, slipping into a nightmare of swirling shapes and colors. The house was fighting back, resisting her touch, trying to prevent her from opening the box. But Julia was no longer afraid. The terror had long since been replaced by a strange calm, an understanding that there was no going back. The mansion had taken so much from her, her family, her safety, her mind, and now it was time to face the final truth. With a trembling breath, Julia opened the box. The world around her shattered, and for a fleeting moment, she thought she saw the faces of her parents and Emma, their expressions twisted in terror. But before she could make sense of it, everything went dark. The light, the room, the mansion, everything vanished into an abyss of nothingness, and Julia fell into it, consumed by the very house she had tried so desperately to understand. What had she unleashed? The question lingered in her mind as the darkness closed in around her. The silence was deafening. It enveloped Julia like a shroud, the absence of sound more terrifying than any noise could have been. She felt as though she were floating in a void, her body suspended in a space that was neither here nor there. Her thoughts, disjointed and fragmented, flitted through her mind like echoes of a distant memory, impossible to grasp. The darkness that had swallowed her whole seemed to stretch infinitely, an eternal night that had no beginning and no end. She had opened the box. She had crossed the line, and now there was no turning back. She tried to move, to awaken herself from this nightmare, but her body was numb, paralyzed by the weight of her own fear. It wasn't the kind of fear she had felt before, the kind that sparked adrenaline and kept her on edge. It was a deep, oppressive dread that settled into her bones, that made her feel as though the very essence of her being was being pulled apart. The mansion had taken her, but it had also taken something more. It had taken her sense of reality, her connection to the world she had once known. Time, if such a thing existed here, seemed irrelevant. She couldn't tell how long she had been trapped in this void, but in that time, everything she had once understood about the house, her family, and herself had begun to unravel. Memories that had seemed so solid, so certain, now felt like illusions, shifting and fading like smoke in the wind. Her parents, her sister, were they real? Or were they merely creations of the house? Had any of it ever been real at all? And then, just when she thought she could bear the weight of the silence no longer, a sound pierced the darkness. A whisper, faint but unmistakable, calling her name. Julia! The voice was familiar, yet it was distorted, warped by something dark and unnatural. It seemed to come from all directions at once, reverberating through the air like 1,000 voices merging into one. Her heart raced, and instinctively, she tried to cover her ears to block out the noise. But the whisper only grew louder, more insistent. Julia, you're still here. We're still here. The words echoed in her mind, and she felt an icy chill settle over her. She wasn't alone. She had never been alone. The realization hit her like a blow to the chest, a surge of panic flooding her veins. The house had always been alive, but now it was aware of her every move, her every thought. It was as though it had been watching her all along, waiting for her to uncover its secrets, to awaken the dark force that slumbered within its walls. The mansion wasn't just a building. It was a consciousness, a malevolent presence that had been feeding on her fear and confusion from the moment she set foot inside. Why are you doing this? Julia's voice was barely a whisper, but it was enough to break through the oppressive silence. She didn't expect an answer, didn't even know what she would do if she received one. But the whispering continued, growing louder with each passing moment, until it filled her entire being. Because you are ours. You always have been. The words sent a chill down her spine, a realization that made her stomach turn. She had thought she was in control, that by discovering the truth, she could escape the house's grip. But now she saw it clearly. The mansion had never intended to let her go. It had always been a part of her, just as she was a part of it. The house had been waiting for her, for the moment when she would finally cross the line and awaken the darkness that had been lying dormant for so long. Her mind raced as she tried to understand what this meant, but the more she thought about it, the more the truth seemed to slip through her fingers. How could she have been so blind? The house had been drawing her in from the start, playing with her, manipulating her emotions, her memories. It had preyed on her grief, on her loneliness, on her desire for connection. And now, as the whispers grew louder and more urgent, she realized that there was no escape. There never had been. Suddenly, she felt a cold, clammy hand on her shoulder, and she spun around, her heart pounding in her chest. But there was nothing there, only the darkness swallowing her whole. The hand had been real, or at least it had felt real, and that was enough to send her into a frenzy. She had been touched by the house itself, and now it was dragging her deeper into its web. It wasn't just a building. It was a parasite, feeding off her fear, off her memories, off her very soul. The walls seemed to close in around her, pressing in from all sides as if the house were trying to crush her under its weight. But even in the face of this overwhelming force, a strange sense of clarity began to form within her. She understood, now, that the mansion had always been her prison. She had come here seeking answers, but in doing so, she had sealed her fate. The house had been a reflection of her own mind, her own fears, and now it had become something more, a living, breathing entity that would never let her go. In the final moments before the darkness consumed her completely, Julia made a decision. She had to break free, to sever the connection between herself and the house. She couldn't do it alone, not without help, and she knew that she would never escape until she found the key. But the key wasn't in the box, or the symbols, or the whispers. It was within herself. The house had made her part of it, but she was still human, still capable of defiance. If she could tap into that last fragment of her will, she might be able to break the cycle, to destroy the mansion once and for all. With a cry of desperation, Julia focused all her energy on one thought: I am not yours. The darkness roared in response, but she held firm, determined to reclaim what was hers. The mansion would not win. Not this time. The silence that had once consumed Julia now felt different, more profound, as though it were no longer an emptiness but a deep, knowing stillness. She had fought to break free, to sever the invisible strings that bound her to the mansion. And now, in this final moment, she felt as though she had come to the precipice of something far beyond her understanding. The darkness, which had once felt like an insurmountable force, now seemed to pause in quiet reverence. It was as if the mansion itself was holding its breath, waiting for her next move. Julia's mind raced, her heart still pounding in her chest. She had taken a stand, had chosen to defy the pull of the house, but the question lingered. Would it be enough? The house had always been a part of her, a reflection of her deepest fears and desires. In truth, she realized it had been with her all her life, feeding on her insecurities, her guilt, and her regrets. But now, in this moment of clarity, she understood something that had eluded her for so long. The mansion's power came not from the walls, nor the whispers that echoed through its halls. It came from the very essence of her own unresolved trauma. In the center of her mind, she saw the house as it truly was, a dark mirror. It was not the place she had imagined it to be. It was not merely haunted or cursed or supernatural in the traditional sense. It was a creation of her own making. Every room, every hallway, every flickering light had been born from the shadows of her own memories and emotions. It had adapted to her presence, reshaping itself to reflect her inner turmoil. Her grief over her family's sudden disappearance, her guilt for things left unsaid, and her fear of losing control had all been channeled into the house, giving it form and substance. As she stood at the center of this revelation, Julia realized that in order to defeat the mansion, she could not simply will herself free. She had to face her own demons, those she had buried deep within herself, and confront them with the same courage she had summoned to resist the house's control. The house had become a physical manifestation of her repressed fears, but now she was stronger. She was no longer the lost girl who had stumbled into this mansion, searching for answers she didn't understand. She was the woman who had faced the darkness, who had finally begun to understand her own power. The whispers that had once taunted her with their distorted voices began to shift. The familiar calling of her name seemed to falter, like a fading echo, losing its hold on her mind. Julia could feel the change, a subtle but undeniable shift in the air. The mansion, which had once towered over her, now seemed smaller, less threatening. The walls, which had closed in on her, now felt as if they were retreating, their oppressive presence dissipating with each breath she took. The power it had over her was weakening. But even as she felt the house's hold loosen, she knew she was not out of danger yet. The mansion's final trick had yet to reveal itself. The darkness had a way of shifting, of showing Julia only what it wanted her to see, and she had no doubt that it would try to lure her back into its grasp. As she stepped forward, she heard the sound of footsteps behind her, slow, deliberate, echoing in the vast emptiness. Her instincts screamed at her to turn around, but she forced herself to remain still, to breathe deeply and center herself. The figure that emerged from the shadows was not what she expected. It was not a monster, nor a ghost, nor any of the horrific beings she had imagined in the heat of her fear. It was a woman, her mother. But it wasn't just her mother. It was an idealized version of her, one that Julia had longed for, one that had always existed in the recesses of her mind. The woman before her had the same features, the same smile, but there was something wrong in her eyes, something hollow and distorted. She was a reflection of Julia's unhealed wounds, a manifestation of the unresolved pain that had tied her to this place. "Why are you doing this?" Julia's voice cracked, the question coming out more as a plea than an accusation. Her mother's image smiled, but it wasn't comforting. It was empty, as though it were nothing more than a cruel facsimile of the love Julia had longed for. "You never really left, did you?" she asked. Her mother's form nodded slowly. "I've always been here, Julia, just as you've always been here. The house was never separate from you. We are the same." The truth struck Julia like a blow to the chest. The house, the darkness, the fear, it was all part of her. It had never been about the mansion itself. It had been about the unresolved grief, the years of guilt, the lost pieces of herself she had abandoned in the name of survival. The mansion had been a prison, but it had also been a reflection of her own mind, of the parts of her that she had never allowed to heal. In that moment, Julia understood she no longer needed to fight the house or the ghost of her mother. She needed to forgive herself. She needed to let go of the pain that had kept her bound to this place. The mansion had no power over her except the power she had given it. With a final, resolute breath, Julia took the first step toward the exit. She no longer looked back. As she moved through the mansion, the shadows began to dissolve. The walls that had once felt suffocating now seemed to melt away, and the oppressive darkness that had loomed over her retreated into nothingness. With each step, Julia felt lighter, freer. She was no longer trapped, and when she finally stepped outside into the blinding light of day, the mansion behind her had disappeared, as though it had never been. The house was gone, but Julia, truly free, was not the same person who had entered it. She had learned the most painful but necessary truth. In order to escape the darkness, she had to confront it within herself. The mansion was no more. The shadows were gone. But Julia knew that the journey was just beginning. The true healing would take time, but now she had the strength to face it.